This week, something fundamentally shifted in the waters of the Middle East. Dozens of heavily armed speedboats belonging to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps suddenly surged their patrol frequencies, swarming dangerously close to international commercial vessels. They did not fire a single shot, they did not board a single tanker, but they did not have to. That single calculated maneuver is enough to wipe trillions of dollars off the global stock market in the coming days. We are talking about the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow stretch of water, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, yet it acts as the absolute jugular vein of the global economy. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's entire liquid petroleum supply flows through this tiny geographical bottleneck. When that bottleneck tightens even a fraction of an inch, the entire world holds its breath. Right now, we are staring down the barrel of the $150 oil trap. That is a price point that would instantly reignite crushing inflation across the West and almost certainly drag major economies into a deep, unforgiving recession. If you turn on the mainstream news right now, you will hear a lot of shouting about World War III. You will hear pundits claiming Washington is dusting off plans to bomb Tehran into submission. But if you actually look at the internal memos, the shifting of military assets and the quiet diplomatic backchannels, a very different picture emerges. The actual goal of the United States right now is not preparing for a massive ground invasion. It is desperately trying to prevent a flawless campaign of economic extortion, a campaign so brilliantly asymmetric that the most powerful military in human history is struggling to counter it with traditional firepower. To understand what the U.S. is really preparing for, we have to look at the state of the board before this week's turning point. For months, the Persian Gulf has been locked in a state of cold tension. The major players have been growling at each other, posturing, but strictly maintaining a safe distance. There was an unspoken rule: you can play geopolitics, but you do not disrupt the flow of oil. Both sides know the history here. Back in the 1980s, during the tanker war, things spiraled out of control, and nobody wants a repeat of that chaos. Iran's calculus has always been a high-wire act. The regime needs to project overwhelming deterrence against the United States and Israel. They need to look incredibly strong to their domestic audience to relieve internal political pressure. But at the same time, they are acutely aware that crossing the ultimate red line, triggering an all-out direct war with the United States, would be devastating. On the flip side, Washington's priorities are equally constrained. The U.S. simply must maintain freedom of navigation. It is the foundational pillar of the modern globalized economy. Any disruption in Hormuz means higher gas prices at home, and no American administration wants to face an electorate furious about skyrocketing inflation. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why now? What intelligence signals forced the U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, to suddenly elevate its combat readiness status this week? Why did the IRGC decide that this specific moment was the time to escalate their naval patrols? Here is where we need to break a very common, very dangerous assumption. If you ask the average person on the street, they will probably tell you that the United States Navy, with its supercarriers and advanced destroyers, could sweep the Strait of Hormuz clean in 24 hours. They assume American military supremacy translates to instant control of the sea. The Pentagon knows that is a fantasy. Wiping out the Iranian conventional navy might be relatively straightforward for American forces. But clearing a massive, dense field of naval mines laid at the bottom of the ocean, doing it fast enough to save the global supply chain before markets completely collapse, that is functionally impossible. And Iran knows it. This brings us into the gray zone of asymmetric warfare. Let us look at what Iran is actually deploying. They are not sending out billion-dollar destroyers to trade broadsides with the Americans. They rely on swarm tactics. Imagine dozens, sometimes hundreds, of highly maneuverable fast attack craft armed with anti-ship missiles coordinating with cheap suicide drones and low-tech sea mines. The objective of this swarm is not to sink a massive U.S. aircraft carrier. Sinking a carrier would invite a catastrophic retaliatory strike. The goal is strategic ambiguity. It is about creating just enough chaos, just enough noise, and just enough threat to cause sheer panic in the financial markets while staying just below the threshold that would justify a massive American military response. It is a masterclass in pushing the envelope without tearing it, and this is where the real leverage lies. It is not about military hardware, it is about the power of fear and the cold, hard math of economics. People assume Iran has to physically park a warship in the middle of the strait to block it. They do not. They literally just have to fire a few warning shots across the bow of a commercial vessel. Or they board and briefly detain a single random oil tanker. Once that happens, the maritime insurance market panics. The war risk premiums, the extra insurance cost a shipping company has to pay to sail through a conflict zone will skyrocket exponentially. We are talking about premiums jumping so high that moving the oil becomes financially ruinous. When the massive insurance syndicates in London refuse to underwrite the journey, the shipping conglomerates will simply order their captains to drop anchor and wait. Iran does not have to close the Strait of Hormuz. The free market driven by risk aversion and profit margins will close the strait for them, which leads to a very uncomfortable truth about American energy independence, a truth that often gets buried in political rhetoric. You hear it all the time, the year is 2026, and the US produces more crude oil than any other nation in the history of the world. In theory, America is energy independent. They do not physically need Middle Eastern oil to keep the lights on. But that is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the global commodity market works. The price of oil is entirely fungible. It is a single interconnected global pool. If the Strait of Hormuz is choked off, 20% of the global supply vanishes overnight. Countries in Asia and Europe will panic buy whatever oil they can find, driving the global price into the stratosphere. So even though the oil in Texas stays in America, the price of that Texas oil is still pegged to the global panic. If Hormuz closes on a Tuesday, a factory worker in Ohio or a teacher in Texas will be paying 50% more for a gallon of gas by Friday. American energy independence is completely real on paper, but it is utterly defenseless against the shockwaves of a ruptured global logistics chain. That is the true vulnerability. The United States cannot drill its way out of a Middle Eastern maritime blockade. If the military option is a logistical nightmare and the economic fallout is an existential threat to the American domestic economy, what exactly is the United States preparing to do? You have a localized threat acting globally. You have a superpower trying to fight a swarm of hornets with a sledgehammer. And you have a clock ticking down to an economic catastrophe. The reality of Washington's playbook right now is far more complex and frankly far more desperate than the official press briefings will ever admit. We have to look past the aircraft carriers. We have to look at what is happening in the quiet rooms of the Treasury Department, the backchannels of Middle Eastern diplomacy, and the frantic recalculations of global supply chains. Because the United States is not preparing for an amphibious invasion. They are preparing a massive invisible firewall. And to understand how that firewall is supposed to work and why it might completely fail, we have to look at the exact moves the Pentagon is hiding in plain sight. When we look at what Washington is actually doing behind the scenes, we have to completely discard the Hollywood narrative of an impending amphibious invasion. The Pentagon is not drafting plans for D-Day on the Iranian coast. Instead, the United States military is rapidly shifting to a contingency framework that we can call Plan B. This involves the quiet activation of highly selective armed escort protocols. If you remember Operation Sentinel from a few years ago, imagine that, but scaled up and stripped of its public relations veneer. The U.S. military is quietly reallocating its most advanced intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance assets from other global theaters directly to the Persian Gulf. We are seeing MQ-9 Reaper drones and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft being redirected to maintain a relentless 24/7 unblinking eye over every single mile of that water. They are mapping every speedboat, tracking every radar signature, and monitoring every radio frequency. But military posturing is only the visible edge of the blade. The real action, the moves that will actually dictate whether we see a global market crash this week, are happening through the diplomatic backdoors. Washington is frantically utilizing intermediaries primarily through the diplomatic channels of Oman and Qatar to deliver a very specific, silent ultimatum to Tehran. The message is not a broad declaration of war. It is highly calculated and surgical. The message is we will not strike first, and we will tolerate a certain level of your regional theater, but if a single American flagged commercial vessel is physically harmed, the retaliation will not be against your fast attack craft. It will be a systematic, overwhelming aerial campaign to dismantle your domestic oil refining infrastructure. It is a threat designed to hit the only asset the regime truly cares about, which is its ability to generate revenue to survive. Yet even with that ultimatum on the table, the White House knows that relying purely on military deterrence is a losing gamble. The most powerful weapon the United States is preparing right now does not reside in the halls of the Pentagon. It is being assembled by the Department of Energy and the Department of the Treasury. The administration is desperately trying to build an economic buffer to absorb the shock if deterrence fails. Behind closed doors, officials are aggressively evaluating the capacity to trigger another massive release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Simultaneously, an intense pressure campaign is being quietly waged on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Why them? Because they possess the ultimate geographical cheat code in this conflict. They have massive oil pipelines that completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Washington is leaning heavily on Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to guarantee that if the strait is compromised, they will immediately ramp up their pipeline export capacity to the absolute maximum limit. The goal is to flood the market through the back door to counteract the panic at the front door. The US government is essentially trying to rig the global oil market to survive a localized heart attack. But here is the twist, the geopolitical reality that mainstream coverage consistently fails to mention. This entire standoff, this localized escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, is a perfectly designed trap for the United States. And you have to ask yourself if Washington gets bogged down in a massive, incredibly expensive, and politically disastrous naval containment operation in the Middle East, who is actually smiling, who benefits the most from a distracted America and artificially inflated oil prices. The answer is Moscow and Beijing. The Russian economy, heavily sanctioned and entirely dependent on energy exports to fund its ongoing war efforts, thrives when global oil prices spike out of fear. A $100 or $150 barrel of oil is a massive lifeline for the Kremlin. Meanwhile, China plays a completely different yet equally opportunistic game. As the world's largest importer of crude oil, Beijing actually purchases massive quantities of heavily sanctioned Iranian oil at incredibly steep off-the-books discounts. The more isolated Iran becomes, and the more dangerous Hormuz appears to Western shipping, the cheaper China gets to buy its energy in the shadows. The Pentagon strategists know this dark truth. They know that every $1 billion spent deploying carrier strike groups to chase speedboats in the Persian Gulf is $1 billion not spent reinforcing the Indo-Pacific. Every week, the United States is paralyzed by the threat of an Iranian blockade is a week that the balance of global power subtly shifts eastward. America is bleeding strategic focus to protect a waterway that its biggest geopolitical rivals are quietly exploiting. And this brings us to the most devastating part of this entire scenario, the part that hits far away from the war rooms of Washington or the boardrooms of London. If the worst case scenario unfolds, if the miscalculations happen and we actually hit that $150 oil trap, the collateral damage will not be limited to shipping conglomerates. The true victims are the hundreds of millions of ordinary people living in countries completely disconnected from the politics of the Middle East. When the cost of maritime freight doubles or triples overnight, that cost does not just vanish. It is injected directly into the price of global food supplies, basic consumer goods, and industrial materials. It is the textbook definition of imported inflation. For the average American, this is not just about paying an extra $20 or $30 at the gas pump. It goes much, much deeper. If energy-driven inflation surges back into the economy, the Federal Reserve will have absolutely no choice but to keep interest rates in a relentless stranglehold. They will be forced to crush domestic economic growth just to stabilize the currency. That means the mortgage rates for a young family trying to buy their first home in the suburbs will remain completely out of reach. It means the interest on credit card debt for the working class will continue to compound at suffocating levels. Small businesses will freeze hiring because the cost of capital is too high. A localized dispute between armed speedboats and naval destroyers halfway across the world directly translates into the systematic destruction of savings accounts and future opportunities for ordinary citizens. It is a profound realization. The escalation at Hormuz is not just a threat to national security. It is a direct, measurable threat to your personal financial survival. You are paying the premium for a geopolitical standoff you have no control over. So as we watch the posturing and the veiled threats exchanged over the waters of the Gulf, we have to look deeper at the narratives being sold to us. When the White House steps up to the podium and declares they will defend freedom of navigation at all costs, we have to contrast that official statement with the frantic reality unfolding behind the scenes. The reality is that the American political elite are working overtime to de-escalate this crisis in the shadows. A full-blown economic or ecological war in the Persian Gulf is absolute political suicide, particularly in the volatile landscape of 2026. They cannot afford to let this spiral. And if we turn our lens to Tehran, we have to make a crucial distinction between the Iranian government and the Iranian people. The citizens of Iran are currently being crushed under the weight of hyperinflation and severe economic sanctions. For the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, parading armed speedboats through the Strait of Hormuz is not just a message to Washington. It is a calculated domestic tool. It is a way to stoke nationalist fervor project strength and desperately distract the Iranian public from the reality of an economy that is collapsing right under their feet. The threat at sea is a smokescreen for the instability at home. So where exactly does this leave us? If we look at the strategic chessboard, there are three distinct paths this can take. The best case scenario, which intelligence analysts give about a 30% probability, is a quiet mutual de-escalation. The Iranian speedboats slowly reduce their patrol frequencies. The United States Navy scales back its high alert status, and we return to the familiar, uncomfortable gray zone. It is a temporary pause, not a solution. Then there is the worst case scenario hovering at a dangerous 10% probability. This is the miscalculation. This is the nightmare where an Iranian fast attack craft gets too close, a nervous gunner on an American destroyer opens fire, and the cascading chain reaction begins. The United States launches retaliatory airstrikes, Iran responds by aggressively mining the strait, and the waterway goes entirely dark. Oil violently breaches $150 a barrel, and the global recession is instantly locked in. But the most likely outcome, the scenario with a 60% probability, is what we call managed disruption. The Revolutionary Guard will continue to maintain a permanent, low-level threat. They will keep the tension dialed to an exact frequency that keeps global oil prices artificially elevated, which perfectly serves the interests of energy exporters, including Russia. Meanwhile, the United States is forced to bleed billions of dollars maintaining a massive passive military presence. It is a war of attrition on the American taxpayer's wallet. What we are witnessing this week in the Strait of Hormuz is the closing of a chapter in modern history. We are watching the end of the era where the United States can unilaterally act as the global Coast Guard. The financial cost of protecting these international logistical choke points is simply becoming too high. We have entered a fractured security environment where a middle-tier power armed with incredibly cheap asymmetric technology can effectively hijack the macroeconomic stability of a superpower. To answer the central question of what Washington is preparing next, they are not preparing for a war. They are furiously weaving an economic and diplomatic fire blanket. The deployment of the Fifth Fleet is strictly a deterrent mechanism, a very expensive prop to buy time for the diplomats and the energy markets to adjust. The military is not the solution here. It is just holding the line. If you take anything away from this shifting global dynamic, let it be these two core insights. First, the true geopolitical power does not come from actually closing the Strait of Hormuz. The power, the leverage, and the strategic gold mine lie entirely in the credible threat of closing it. Iran does not need to shut the door. They just need to keep their hand hovering over the lock. Second, the concept of domestic energy independence is an illusion if your pricing is tethered to a fragile global supply chain. Producing your own oil does not protect you from a global panic. In the coming days, do not get distracted by the headlines counting the number of warships being deployed to the region. Those are trailing indicators. If you want to know if the global economy is actually about to bleed, open up a financial terminal and track the maritime war risk premiums for the Middle East. When you see those insurance rates cross the threshold of 2% of a vessel's total hull value, that is your warning siren. That is the exact moment the localized posturing becomes a global financial crisis. This leaves us with a profound contradiction to consider. Today, China is the absolute largest buyer of crude oil from the Middle East. Yet it is the American taxpayer who is funding the multi-billion-dollar naval umbrella that keeps those shipping lanes safe for Beijing's tankers. With the United States facing mounting debt and shifting its strategic focus to the Pacific, we have to ask a difficult question. Is it finally time for America to withdraw its naval shield from the Persian Gulf and force the nations that actually consume the oil to pay the price of protecting it? Let me know your perspective down in the comments. Thank you for watching.